Other important questions to ask include: do I perform well under stress, or do I need a highly structured and predictable environment? Do I work best in a big organization or a small one? Few people work well in all kinds of environments. Again and again, I've seen people who were very successful in large organizations flounder miserably when they moved into smaller ones. And the reverse is equally true. The conclusion bears repeating. Do not try to change yourself. You are unlikely to succeed, but work hard to improve the way you perform. And try not to take on work you cannot perform or will only perform poorly. What are my values? To be able to manage oneself, you finally have to ask, what are my values? This is not a question of ethics. With respect to ethics, the rules are the same for everybody, and the test is a simple one. I call it the mirror test. In the early years of this century, the most highly respected diplomat of all the great powers was the German ambassador in London. He was clearly destined for great things to become his country's foreign minister, at least if not its federal chancellor. Yet in 1906 he abruptly resigned rather than preside over a dinner given by the diplomatic corps for Edward VII. The king was a notorious womanizer and made it clear what kind of dinner he wanted. The ambassador is reported to have said, "I refuse to see a pimp in the mirror in the morning when I shave." That is the mirror test. Ethics require that you ask yourself, what kind of person do I want to see in the mirror in the morning? What is ethical behavior in one kind of organization or situation is ethical behavior in another? But ethics is only part of a value system, especially of an organization's value system. To work in an organization whose value system is unacceptable or incompatible with one's own condemns a person both to frustration and to non-performance. Consider the experience of a highly successful human resources executive whose company was acquired by a bigger organization. After the acquisition, she was promoted to do this kind of work she did best, which included selecting people for important positions. The executive deeply believed that a company should hire people for such positions from the outside only after exhausting all the inside possibilities. But her new company believed in first looking outside to bring in fresh blood. There is something to be said for both approaches in my experience. The proper one is to do some of both. They are, however, fundamentally incompatible, not as policies but as values. They bespeak different views of the relationship between organizations and people, different views of the responsibility of an organization to its people and their development, and different views of a person's most important contribution to an enterprise. After several years of frustration, the executive quit at considerable financial loss. Her values and the values of the organization simply were not compatible. Similarly, whether a pharmaceutical company tries to obtain results by making constant small improvements or by achieving occasional, highly expensive and risky breakthroughs is not primarily an economic question. The results of either strategy may be pretty much the same. At bottom, there is a conflict between a value system that sees the company's contribution in terms of helping physicians do better what they already do, and a value system that is oriented toward making scientific discoveries. Whether a business should be run for short-term results or with a focus on the long term is likewise a question of values. Financial analysts believe that businesses can be run for both simultaneously. Successful business people know better. To be sure, every company has to produce short-term results. But in any conflict between short-term results and long-term growth, each company will determine its own priority. This is not primarily a disagreement about economics. It is fundamentally a value conflict regarding the function of a business and the responsibility of management. Value conflicts are not limited to business organizations. One of the fastest growing pastoral churches in the United States measures success by the number of new parishioners. Its leadership believes that what matters is how many newcomers join the congregation. The good Lord will then minister to their spiritual needs, or at least to the needs of a sufficient percentage. Another pastoral evangelical church believes that what matters is people's spiritual growth. The church cases out newcomers who join but do not enter into its spiritual life. Again, this is not a matter of numbers. At first glance, it appears that the second church grows more slowly, but it retains a far larger proportion of newcomers than the first one does. Its growth, in other words, is more solid. This is also not a theological problem, or only secondarily so. It is a problem about values. In a public debate, one pastor argued, "Unless you first come to church, you will never find the gate to the kingdom of heaven." "No," answered the other. "Until you first look for the gate to the kingdom of heaven, you don't belong in church." Organizations, like people, have values. To be effective in an organization, a person's values must be compatible with the organization's values. They do not need to be the same, but they must be close enough to coexist. Otherwise, the person will not only be frustrated, but also will not produce results. A person's strengths and the way that person performs rarely conflict. The two are complementary, but there is sometimes a conflict between a person's values and his or her strengths. What one does well, even very well and successfully, may not fit with one's value system. In that case, the work may not appear to be worth devoting one's life to. If I may, allow me to interject a personal note. Many years ago, I too had to decide between my values and what I was doing successfully. I was doing very well as a young investment banker in London in the mid-1930s, and the work clearly fit my strengths. Yet I did not see myself making a contribution as an asset manager. People, I realized, were what I valued, and I saw no point in being the richest man in the cemetery. I had no money and no other job prospects. Despite the continuing depression, I quit, and it was the right thing to do. Values, in other words, are and should be the ultimate test. Where do I belong? A small number of people know very early where they belong. Mathematicians, musicians, and cooks, for instance, are usually mathematicians, musicians, and cooks by the time they are 4 or 5 years old. Physicians usually decide on their careers in their teens, if not earlier, but most people, especially highly gifted people, do not really know where they belong until they are well past their mid-20s. By that time, however, they should know the answers to the 3 questions. What are my strengths? How do I perform? And what are my values? And then they can and should decide where they belong. Or rather, they should be able to decide where they do not belong. The person who has learned that he or she does not perform well in a bigger organization should have learned to say no to a position in one. The person who has learned that he or she is not a decision maker should have learned to say no to a decision-making assignment. A general pattern should have learned to say no to an independent command. Equally important, knowing the answer to these questions enables a person to say to an opportunity, an offer, or an assignment. Yes, I will do that, but this is the way I should be doing it. This is the way it should be structured. This is the way the relationships should be. These are the kind of results you should expect from me, and in this time frame, because this is who I am. Successful careers are not planned. They develop when people are prepared for opportunities because they know their strengths, their method of work, and their values. Knowing where one belongs can transform an ordinary person, hardworking and competent, but otherwise mediocre, into an outstanding performer. What should I contribute? Throughout history, the great majority of people never had to ask the question, what should I contribute? They were told what to contribute, and their tasks were dictated either by the work itself, as it was for the peasant or artisan, or by a master or a mistress, as it was for domestic servants. And until very recently, it was taken for granted that most people were subordinates who did as they were told. Even in the 1950s and 1960s, the new knowledge workers, the so-called organization men, looked to their company's personnel department to plan their careers. Then in the late 1960s, no one wanted to be told what to do any longer. Young men and women began to ask, what do I want to do? And what they heard was the way to contribute was to do your own thing. But this solution was as wrong as organizations men had been. Very few of the people who believed that doing one's own thing would lead to contribution, self-fulfillment, and success achieved any of the three. But still, there is no return to the old answer of doing what you are told or assigned to do. Knowledge workers in particular have to learn to ask a question that has not been asked before. What should my contributions be? To answer it, they must address three distinct elements. What does the situation require? Given my strengths, my way of performing, and my values, how can I make the greatest contribution to what needs to be done? And finally, what results have to be achieved to make a difference? Consider the experience of a newly appointed hospital administrator. The hospital was big and prestigious, but it had been coasting on its reputation for 30 years. The new administrator decided that his contribution should be to establish a standard of excellence in one important area within 2 years. He chose to focus on the emergency room, which was big, visible, and sloppy. He decided that every patient who came into the ER had to be seen by a qualified nurse within 60 seconds. Within 12 months, the hospital's emergency room had become a model for all hospitals in the United States, and within another 2 years, the whole hospital had been transformed. As this example suggests, it is rarely possible or even particularly fruitful to look too far ahead. A plan can usually cover no more than 18 months and still be reasonably clear and specific. So the question in most cases should be, where and how can I achieve results that will make a difference within the next year and a half? The answer must balance several things. First, the results should be hard to achieve. They should require stretching, to use the current buzzword. But also, they should be within reach. To aim at results that cannot be achieved or that can be only under the most unlikely circumstances is not being ambitious. It is being foolish. Second, the results should be meaningful. They should make a difference. Finally, results should be visible and, if at all possible, measurable. From this will come a course of action, what to do, where, and how to start, and what goals and deadlines to set. Responsibility for relationships. Very few people work by themselves and achieve results by themselves. A few great artists, a few great scientists, a few great athletes. Most people work with others and are effective with other people. That is true whether they are members of an organization or independently employed. Managing yourself requires taking responsibility for relationships. This has two parts. The first is to accept the fact that other people are as much individuals as you yourself are. They perversely insist on behaving like human beings. This means that they too have their strengths, they too have their ways of getting things done, they too have their values. To be effective, therefore, you have to know the strengths, the performance modes, and the values of your coworkers. That sounds obvious, but few people pay attention to it. Typical is the person who was trained to write reports in his or her first assignment because that boss was a reader. Even if the next boss is a listener, the person goes on writing reports that invariably produce no results. Invariably, the boss will think the employee is stupid, incompetent, and lazy, and he or she will fail. But that could have been avoided if the employee had only looked at the new boss and analyzed how this boss performs. Bosses are neither a title on the organization chart nor a function. They are individuals and are entitled to do their work in the way they do it best. It is incumbent on the people who work with them to observe them, to find out how they work, and to adapt themselves to what makes their bosses most effective. This, in fact, is the secret of managing the boss. The same holds true for all your coworkers. Each works his or her way, not your way, and each is entitled to work in his or her way. What matters is whether they perform and what their values are. As for how they perform, each is likely to do it differently. The first secret of effectiveness is to understand the people you work with and depend on so that you can make sure that you can make use of their strengths, their ways of working, and their values. Working relationships are as much based on the people as they are on the work. The second part of the relationship responsibility is taking responsibility for communication. Whenever I or any other consultant start to work with an organization, the first thing I hear about are all the personality conflicts. Most of these arise from the fact that people do not know what other people are doing and how they do their work, or what contribution the other people are concentrating on and what results they expect. And the reason they do not know is that they have not asked and therefore have not been told. This failure to ask reflects human stupidity less than it reflects human history. Until recently, it was unnecessary to tell any of these things to anybody. In the medieval city, everyone in a district pleaded the same trade. In the countryside, everyone in a valley planted the same crop as soon as the frost was out of the ground. Even those few people who did things that were not common worked alone, so they did not have to tell anyone what they were doing. Today, the great majority of people work with others who have different tasks and responsibilities. The marketing vice president may have come out of sales and know everything about sales, but she knows nothing about the things she has never done: pricing, advertising, packaging, and the like. So the people who do these things must make sure that the marketing vice president understands what they are trying to do, why they are trying to do it, how they are going to do it, and what results to expect. If the marketing vice president does not understand what these high-grade knowledge specialists are doing, it is primarily their fault, not hers. They have not educated her. Conversely, it is the marketing vice president's responsibility to make sure that all of her coworkers understand how she looks at marketing, what her goals are, how she works, and what she expects of herself and of each one of them. Even people who understand the importance of taking responsibility for relationships often do not communicate sufficiently with their associates. They are afraid of being thought presumptuous or inquisitive or stupid. They are wrong. Whenever someone goes to his or her associates and says, "This is what I'm good at, this is how I work, these are my values, this is the contribution I plan to concentrate on, and the results I should be expected to deliver," the response is always, "This is most helpful, but why didn't you tell me earlier?"